Welcome back. All right, so in my final look at this year's power rankings, and then I'll put them to bed, and we'll get ready for next year's. Once the Stanley Cup's done, we're getting into the draft and all that. I wanted to look at highs and lows, where they were, top 10, middle 10, final 11. So 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and how many weeks they were in that space. Some teams didn't move around a lot. Other teams moved around a ton. So let's take a look at it. There's not very many that were in all three columns, from the 1 through 10 through 21 to 31. Though it did happen, it was uncommon. So we'll start with Anaheim. Anaheim was 28th four times, as high as they got. They were 31st twice, which is as low as you can get on this board. And for anybody wondering, well, what about when you had Seattle 31st? I didn't count that as actually them being 31st and Buffalo 32nd. So top 10, they never made it. Middle 10, they never made it. They were in the bottom 11, 16 weeks out of 16. So that's a nice way to start it, I guess, is, hey, this is how this is going to work. For Arizona, they were 18th once. That was in week 7. That's as high as they got. Week 9, they hit their lowest point, which was 26th. So it was a bit of a drop from weeks 7 through 9. They were in the top 10, not once. Top 20, 5 times. So from 11 through 20, they were there 5 times. Between 21 and 31, of course, I'm going to put 21 and 30 because I get used to putting it by tens, right? So 21 through 31, they were 11 times in that range on the board. Boston. Boston had an interesting season. They finished second twice. They never finished first in the power rankings in any given week, which they had both of the previous 2 seasons. They were number 14 twice. That was before the trade deadline. They were top 10 11 times. They were in the 11 through 20 range 5 times. And again, that was right around the trade deadline when things looked pretty dire. Buffalo. Buffalo actually finished 23rd twice. They were 31st, including weeks when Vancouver wasn't rated and they were 30th. I've made them 31st on the overall picture 6 times, meaning they were at the bottom of the board 6 times. So, which I think is the most on the board. I don't think anybody else was at the bottom that often. Nope. They've got that. That's their spot. Anaheim, it was only twice. It's just overall, Buffalo got higher up than Anaheim. Buffalo got to 23rd, Anaheim got to 28th. So that's why, on average, Anaheim's lower. 16 times out of 16, they were 21 or lower on the board. Because 23 is as high as they got. So pretty simple math right there. Calgary, the highest they got was 14th, and that was week 1. So week 1, of course, I'm looking at the standings from last year, and I'm looking at how things are going so far early on in the season. And I'm like, yeah, Calgary's 14th. Week 5, they hit their lowest, which was 25th. That's the only time they were 25th on the season. So they were not top 10 at all this year. 8 times they were between 11 and 20. 8 times they were between 21 and 31st. So Calgary had a pretty mediocre season all around. Carolina, they were number 1 in week 10. So they were first on the board in week 10. Week 12, the first week of the season, or they were 12th the first week of the season. That is the only time that they were actually outside the top 10. So 15 out of 16 weeks they were in the top 10, and the only time they weren't was that first week where there's some uncertainty about where everybody's going to be. Chicago, the highest they got was 14th. That was week 7. They started off 31st. They had such a miserable start to the season where they had 3 goalies in 3 games, and none of them looked like they were going to be very good. And it looked like it was going to be a really long season, but then it was that steady climb up to 14th. They climbed every single week through to week 7, and then they started falling back. They were actually between 11th and 20th, 13 out of 16 weeks. The other 3, they were between 21st and 31st. Colorado, they were number 1 4 times in the power rankings. They were 10th once. That was week 8. That was when things were starting to look like maybe they were going to fall apart. But they managed to be top 10 16 out of 16 weeks. So they're one of those rare cases where it's 16 out of 16 weeks. How many teams did that? 1, 2, 3. Just the 3, right? Yeah, just the 3. So there you go. That's something. That's something you can put on a banner and throw up in the building, right? Columbus, week 3, they hit 15th. That was the highest they got. They were 31st twice on the power rankings. So they were top 10, no. 11 through 20, 4 times, and 21 through 31, 12 times. So, long season for Columbus fans. But Columbus fans know that. Dallas, week 2, Dallas got to 10th. They had a great start to the season, really. They looked like they might do something. And then by week 10, all hope was lost. They were down to 28th overall. So they were only top 10 that 1 week, week 2. They were between 11 and 20 for 7 weeks. And for 8 weeks, they were 21st and lower on the board because they just kept losing in overtime and in shootouts. They just could not get victories. Victories will decide who moves up. And this is the thing that I try to point out. I don't bump teams up when they lose in overtime, when they lose in shootouts. I don't go, well, this team's lost 3 games this week, but hey, they're really trying, and at least they're getting points. I go, you know what? I can't bump them up over a team that's winning games this week. It's I know that's crazy, but that's how that works. I was so happy Dallas didn't actually get in based on overtime and shootout loss points, because that's a terrible way to make the playoffs. I know there's some fans like, hey, make the playoffs. But for me, I want to see the team that wins more games in the playoffs. Detroit, they actually had a pretty good year, comparatively speaking, on the power rankings. So last year, they were at the bottom of the power rankings a lot. This year, only once. Week 3, they were 31st. Week 15, they were 21st. So pretty good season by Detroit standards. Of course, all 16 weeks, they were 21st through 31st. Didn't quite get to 20th to get out of that 00-16, which ties them with Buffalo. Anaheim was 0-0-16. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Those are the teams that were in the bottom 11 every week. Was Anaheim, Buffalo, and Detroit. Everybody else avoided that fate. Ottawa, close. Edmonton, the highest they got was 5th. That was in week 6. The lowest they were was 22nd. That was week 1. Miserable start to the season for Edmonton. They and Vancouver both started the season terribly, but Edmonton bounced back nicely. They were in the top 10 4 weeks, between 11th and 20th, 10 weeks, and a lot of those weeks they're 11th. And they were 21st through 31st just the 2 weeks, including that week where they were 22nd. They moved up to 21st the second week. Basically, the last 14 weeks of the season, they never dropped out of the top 20. Florida, they were number 4 in week 8. They started the season 2 weeks in a row. They were 17th, and it was that they were winning, but they were winning against Chicago. They were winning games that I didn't really have a lot of. I think part of it is there's sort of a PTSD thing with them, with Florida, where you're like, things are going to fall apart, right? But either way, they were only outside the top 10 3 times this year. They never dropped into the bottom column here, and they were in the top 10 13 times out of 16. So Florida had a pretty good year. LA never reached the top 10. The highest they got was 18th twice. The lowest they got was 30th. That's in week. Notice I'm still carrying the marker. Week 16, not week 18. There was no week 18. Week 16, they were 30th. That's the lowest they got. And they really fell apart at the end of the season. So they were in the top 20 5 times. They were never in the top 10. And between 21st and 31st, 11 times. So overall, kind of the season you would have expected for LA. Minnesota, the highest they got. I don't know why I kept rating 18. But again, that's why I have the marker. Week 16, the last week of the season, they were number 7. That was the highest they got all season. The lowest they got was 15th. That was week 5, so they never dropped out of the top 16. 8 weeks, they were between 1 and 10. 8 weeks, they were between 11 and 20. Pretty solid season all around. And remember, the lowest they got is 15th. So Minnesota never dropped below 15th on the board. Montreal, interesting season for Montreal. They started the season 3rd on the power rankings, number 3, which even Montreal fans went, wait, no, stop that. And they were in the top 10 the first 5 weeks of the season. Yeah. By the end of the season, they were 19th. They weren't winning games. It looked like at the end of the season, they didn't really have a lot of interest in being in the playoffs. But Calgary and Vancouver didn't have any interest in being there either. So default. And then in the playoffs, the storyline completely changes. They knock out Toronto, they knock out Winnipeg. But they were 19th that last week on the power rankings. They weren't playing very well. They had 5 weeks in the top 10, 11 weeks between 11th and 20th. And here we are. They're in the Final Four. Nashville. The highest they got was 13th. That was for 2 weeks. That was in the second half of the season. The lowest they got was 27th. That was week 5, and things were miserable. That was when everybody, the vultures are circling, and they got to trade Ekholm. They're going to have to trade this guy and that guy. Oh, this guy's going to go. Is Rinne going to be traded? None of it ended up happening. They never made the top 10. 6 times they were between 11th and 20th. 10 times between 21st and 31st. So a horrible season that turned out to be a pretty good year for Nashville. New Jersey, twice they were 18th on the board. That's the highest they get. The lowest they got is 30th. That was week 14. Second half of the season was miserable for New Jersey fans. Never made the top 10. 3 times. They were between 11th and 20th on the rankings, and 21st and lower 13 out of 16 weeks. So New Jersey ranked in the bottom 11 often. New York, the Islanders, the highest they got was 5th. That was week 8. That was during that huge winning streak. Very hot and cold season for the Islanders overall. They were 16th twice on the rankings, never dropped out of the top 16. So I never saw them as a team that wouldn't make the playoffs. I saw them as a team that, who knows, it's Barry Trotz. And so you kind of go through the regular season, you win some, you lose some, and then in the postseason, Barry Trotz is fantastic. So they were in the top 10 7 weeks, and they were between 11 and 20, 11 and 9 weeks out of the 16. So yeah, for the Islanders, they definitely had their run. They get up to 5th, but postseason, what difference does home ice make? Not a whole lot to the New York Islanders. New York Rangers, the highest they got was 14th. They got there twice. They were 27th once, and that was the second week of the season. So they never reached the top 10. 11 weeks. 11 weeks. They were between 11th and 20th, and in the bottom 11, 5 times. The Rangers, again, I've said this before, they had a better season than what people are going to remember because of all the drama at the end of the year. Watch out for them next year. Ottawa, the highest they got on the board is 15th. That was the last week of the season. I moved them up 15th, and a lot of people said, wait, what? How can they be 15th? And they're not playing, they're not in the playoffs. They're not playing in the playoffs. Why would they be 15th? They played really, really well. And if they had made the playoffs over Montreal, who knows? Maybe it's Ottawa that's in the Final Four. They were 31st once, and that was the second week. So Ottawa and Detroit were 31st in back-to-back weeks, but neither of them saw 31st again during the season. So again, Ottawa, a team that was routinely at the bottom of the board for the two years running, not this year. They never made the top 10. They were 11th through 20th once. That's at the end of the season, meaning that right now they're standing on the board, as I'm looking at it, as 17th, because the top 16 are the playoff teams. I have them 17th on the board right now. And 15 weeks they were at the bottom. And that's just because they had a horrible start to the season. And you can look at that end of the season and say they played great, but people will point out, and they'll be right, when there's no pressure on a team to win, sometimes it's just easier. And so it doesn't necessarily translate into a big year the year after. It might for Ottawa. It might not. Philly. So now we're in the final column over here. Philadelphia, they were 7th in week 4. They had a really good start to the season. They did. They were 25th twice. That was when they weren't having a good part of the year. They were in the top 10 3 times, 11th through 20th 7 times, and then 21st through 31st 6 times. So it was a good year, and then it just fell right off for Philadelphia. Again, don't overcorrect. Pittsburgh, they were 4th the 1 week. That was the final week of the season. They had moved all the way up to 4th. They were 17th once. That was the 3rd week of the season. They had a start that made it look like they might miss the playoffs. By the end of the year, they looked like they were a contender. And then it just didn't work out in the playoffs again because Barry Trotz reasons. So they were top 10 7 times. They were 11 through 20 on the board 9 times. Never fell out of the top 20. San Jose, rough year for San Jose. They were 19th. That was in week 2. That's as high as they got. They were 27th twice. So only 8 spots difference. And if you look, there's 8 spots difference here. What's another small 8 spots different with Buffalo? So 8 spots with Minnesota, with Buffalo. Who else is 8? Because it's just interesting to see teams that don't move a whole lot on the board. And that's it. Anybody else that's 8 or less? Oh, Toronto, it's only 7. Vegas, it's 7. Winnipeg, it's 8. So there's some teams that really don't move around a lot, and San Jose is one of them. Twice, they were in the top 20. The other 14 weeks, they were 21st and lower on the board. St. Louis, they started the season 6th. They were number 6 on the board first week of the season, And yeah, they looked like they should be one of the contenders in the West. By week 11, where they were 22nd, that's the lowest they got. Yeah, that storyline had definitely changed. They were top 10 4 weeks. They were 11th through 20th 11 weeks. Only outside the top 20 once, and that's the week they were 22nd. That's the week where I made the video on how that doesn't look like they're going to make the playoffs, and then they did. So that video made it happen. That's how I'm going to rate it. Tampa was number 1 6 times. So that is the most of anybody on the board. Vegas was number 1 4 times. Colorado was number 1 4 times. Vegas 6 times. They were 11th once. Now, what's interesting is Tampa was 11th that last week of the season, week 16, where it looked like they were just backing into the playoffs. Didn't matter that they were backing into the playoffs, did it? Because they're still alive in the playoffs. 15 weeks they were in the top 10. That last week of the season is the only time they dropped outside the top 10. And I kept saying with the power rankings, maybe they're just biding their time. Maybe they've learned from previous seasons. You don't kill it and try to get a President's Trophy, because often that's not worth it. Toronto was number 1 once. That was week 5. I remember that power rankings. And they were number 8 twice. And I remember those power rankings as well. Toronto was always the whole lightning rod. Interesting, since they're right underneath the lightning, alphabetically. But there will always be a tremendous divergence of opinion on where Toronto should be on a power rankings. And I expect that to be the case every single season. There was the first year I did power rankings, I actually put them in the penalty box one week and didn't even rank them, because there were so many comments the week before about Toronto this, Toronto that. And I'm like, I'm not even going to rate them on this week, so I'm just going to leave them off to the side, because it's a nightmare. But they were in the top 10 every week. 16 weeks they were in the top 10, top 8, all 16 weeks. And then, of course, in the playoffs, they had that 3-1 series lead. Then they didn't. And in October, we'll see how the next chapter starts for Toronto. Vancouver, they were 18th twice. That's as high as they got. They were 31st 3 times. So they were in the top 20 twice. And each time that it looked like they were turning it around, they fell right off again. And by the end of the year, it was miserable. That was a horrible schedule. So 14 times they were 21st or lower. I'm expecting a better year next year from Vancouver. Really am. Vegas, number 1 4 times, as I mentioned previously. Number 8 once. That was week 11 that they were actually 8th on the board. All 16 weeks they're in the top 10. So they had a fantastic season. 4 weeks at number 1. And again, you can point out, well, their division sucked. Doesn't matter. They won all the games. If they hadn't won the games, everybody be piling onto them going, they can't even beat the California teams. They suck. So they won the games. Washington, they were 4th 5 times. they were 4th. That's where they ended up, 5 times. The lowest they got was 14th. That was week 5. They had some rough patches during the year. They ended up with a pretty good record. And yeah, 4th 5 times on the board. They were in the top 10 14 weeks. And twice they fell outside the top 10. They never fell outside the top 20. Winnipeg, 4 times they were 9th. Never got higher than 9th. Interesting note, every time that I would do a power rankings, I would call my wife in and I'd say, what do you think of where Winnipeg is? And she'd go, yeah, that's about right. So I do. I actually get feedback from her before I do the power rankings board. I will focus in on a couple of teams and say, what do you think? And I always focused in on the Jets. They were 17th once, and that was week 15. Again, what do you think? And she's like, yeah, you're probably right. They had a rough time going into the playoffs. But of course, again, once the playoffs get started, it is a different game. And I've said that when it comes to power rankings, that this is fun. This is the regular season side of things. And in the postseason, it can change. And that's part of the reason we love the playoffs so much. 5 times Winnipeg was in the top 10, and 11 times they were between 11 and 20. And I hate that they were 11 times between 11 and 20, because they were 11th or 12th for almost that entire 11 that's on that board. Almost every one of them, they're either 11th or 12th. So kind of rough. Definitely makes it look like their ranking was a lot lower than it was. But yeah, there you go. All 31 teams. Next year, it'll be 32. And looking forward to seeing how Seattle does and where they end up on the overall board. And who ends up number 1 next year. I will say this. I am surprised. There are some surprises here. I am surprised Pittsburgh was never first. I am surprised that Boston wasn't first at any point during the season. And I was kind of surprised to see Calgary never got back up to 14th at any point during the season. So, yeah, there's some surprises for me as well. All right, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. And this is it. That's it. I'm going to erase the stats from this year's power rankings, and that'll be it. But I wanted to do this because it gives more of a... This is sort of an add-on to the one that I did earlier this week. And it gives more of a picture of how everybody did. And again, who was number one? 4 times for Colorado, 4 times for Vegas, 6 times for Tampa. And 2 of them are still going. Montreal, the highest they got was 3rd. Islanders, highest they got was 5th. And those guys are still going as I record this. All right, let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.